Okay, the reading for this week is the Doctrine of the Mean, or the Zhongyong. And just to review, this is a series on the Sishu Wujing, which is a general term for the 4 books and the 5 classics of Confucianism. Sishu is the 4 books, Wujing, 5 classics. The 4 books were established by Zhu in the 12th century, and these included the Analects of Confucius, the Lunyu, the Book of Mencius, the Mengzi, the Great Learning, Daxue, which we've already done, the Doctrine of the Mean, Zhongyong, which I'm about to read now, and the 5 classics, which were compiled or assembled much earlier, consisted of the Book of Documents, the Wujing, the Classic of Poetry, the Shun, or Shijing, the Book of Rites, the Liji, which is a very long, sprawling work, and we've already done the first section from that work, and the Daxue and the Zhongyong were originally included in that work, and they were later extracted from it by Zhu in the 12th century in the Song Dynasty and made into independent works and included in the 4 books, but they originally come from the Book of Rites, the Liji, the Book of Changes, the I Ching, sometimes called the I Ching, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. Okay, so that information I'll provide in the study guide and in the description below, so you can review it, so you memorize what the contents of the 4 books are and the contents of the 5 classics are. Okay, so now I will be reading the Doctrine of the Mean, which is one of the 4 books. Doctrine of the Mean, Zhongyong in Chinese. And again, this is Professor Robert Eno's translation, and he provides an excellent introduction to these works too. So I'm going to read his introduction, followed by his translation. Introduction to the Doctrine of the Mean, Professor Robert Eno, and this document I will make available in the description below. The Doctrine of the Mean, or the Zhongyong, is significantly longer and more complex than the Daxue, the Great Learning, which we did yesterday, and which we noted was very short. It has 2 sections. The first is the text, and followed by commentary, and it was in total just several pages. Zhu of the 12th century, the Song Dynasty, great Neo-Confucian thinker, Zhu distinguished 33 chapters in the originally... Hold on, let me enlarge the font here so I can read it. Okay, Zhu distinguished 33 chapters in the originally undivided text, and these have been preserved in the translation. However, Zhu's divisions do not clarify the overall structure of the text, and a set of section divisions have been added here in order to guide readers through the shifting topical areas that the Doctrine of the Means, Zhongyong, engages. In the case of one particularly long chapter in Zhu's classification, chapter 20, a mid-chapter topic pivot is obscured by Zhu's arrangement, and for that chapter subsections have been added. The title of the text is not without problems, Zhongyong. Literally, it may mean the central ordinary practice, or perhaps brings centered in ordinary practice, but both somewhat puzzling ideas. The notion of ordinariness is important to the text. One of its key points is that morality is a characteristic feature of ordinary everyday spontaneity, and that our ordinary experience, rather than any elusive or esoteric wisdom, is the raw substance of the Tao, the way. Interestingly, the word glossed with the compound term ordinary practice, yong, the yong of Zhongyong, ordinary practice, is encountered in a related sense in a key passage of the Junza chapter, Seeing Things as Equal, which reads, "Things cannot have any completeness or impairment. All are in the final analysis comprehended as one. Only the person of full attainment knows how to comprehend them as one. He affirms nothing as so. His affirmation is lodged in ordinary practice." Yong. Ordinary practice means use. Use is comprehension. To comprehend is to grasp. Once you grasp it, you're nearly there. End quote from the Junza. The Junza claim is that by a readjustment of perspective, from one that seeks wisdom through truth statements about what is so, to one that is immersed in action without attachment to assertions and denials of any kind, a person can both understand and act perfectly within the dynamic flow of affairs. I believe that there is, in fact, a significant area of convergence on this point between the Taoist ideas of the Junza and the very Confucian Zhongyong, Doctrine of the Mean, which seeks to unite the person with the creative flow of nature, heaven and earth, the Tianqi, I forget the Chinese pronunciation, what's it? Tenchi in Japanese, heaven and earth, through an abiding sensitivity to the simple moral responses that pervade our daily lives and that are the focus of great learning. Di, I think, is the Chinese reading of Qi. So Tian Di. Let's check on that. It's been a while since I studied Chinese. Structure of the text. It can be difficult to keep track of the Zhongyong, Doctrine of the Mean's underlying unity of theme. The style of the text changes as it proceeds, moving from a form anchored around quotes from Confucius, which dominates the first half of the text, to a succession of poetic celebrations of the power of holistic wisdom to transform the human world and the cosmos. In providing a structural framework for this translation, I've tried to convey my personal sense of the musicality of the text. I do not mean to claim that the text is dominated by rhymed or metrically regular passages that could have been set to music. I suggest music as a metaphor, drawing attention to the varied textures of the doctrine's prosody, starting from the almost oracular drama of the opening lines and ending with the haunting calmness of its final section, which evokes its stated topic of soundlessness. If there is any unity of underlying intellectual theme, it is conveyed through a variety of prosodic dynamics that build toward a crescendo and then subside. So prosodic, prosody, of course the sort of rules and regulations of poetry is what that word means. I have marked the opening chapter, that is the text Jiuxi, identified as a unified initial statement which he labeled chapter 1 as the theme. So the translator here, Professor Eno, has added this title to the first chapter and calls it the theme. The theme introduces a cluster of key terms that play important roles throughout the text. Tian, which is heaven, usually translated as our nature, human nature. Xing, kanji for say. The Tao, which is the path or way we are meant to travel in ethical action. Literally also means road, the kanji for it, the Hanzi. The ideal moral character of the Junzu, and centrality, or Zhong, the Zhong of Zhongyong, kanji for naka, or the mean. The message, those are the main key cluster, the cluster of key terms that appear. So make a note of these: the Tian, Xing, Tao, and the Junza, and his ideal moral character, and the idea of centrality, or the mean, Zhong. The message of the doctrine concerns the way in which a person can become a sage by maintaining the centrality characteristic of the Tao and of our Tian endowed nature. So our nature, Xing, is endowed by Tian, and in doing so become the equal partner of heaven and earth, Tiandi. The initial chapter ties these ideas together with the image of something beyond sight and sound that we must search out. As we will discover at the end of the final chapter, which I've marked as the coda, this invisible and inaudible quality is possessed by both the Junza and the cosmos. Commentators have tended to agree that the concept that corresponds to this elusive linking quality is Cheng. The kanji in Japanese, it's read as Asei or Makoto. A key term for the doctrine, Cheng. So underline this term, Cheng, translated here by the awkward phrase perfect genuineness. Okay, it's usually translated as sincerity in Japanese. Another key term in this work. The first half of the Zhongyong, Doctrine of the Mean, takes us toward this concept in stages. This concept of Cheng, perfect genuineness. In section 1, chapters 2 to 11, a string of quotes from Confucius tells us that the main obstacle to following the Tao, the pathway, is not learning what it is, but the enormous effort of staying on it. Its secret does not lie in strange arts. strange arts usually refers to Taoism, I think. It lies in finding the persistence to walk it forever, to be centered in ordinary practice until death. In Section 2, chapters 12 to 16, we learn that so far from being a mystery, the Tao is actually present to ordinary people in ordinary practice. These chapters reinforce the mentioned notion that every person is an incipient sage, and that it is our common institutions that we should seek guidance. Our journey on the Tao starts from common experience, but by the end of the section we see the Junza following the Tao to exalted heights and catch a glimpse of the invisible world of the spirits and the subtle quality of perfect genuineness, Chang, manifestations of the invisible thread that binds all that Tian, heaven, has destined for human destiny. Section 3, chapters 17 to 19, reframes the greatness of the heroes of history, the sage kings celebrated in all early Confucian texts, so the kings of the Zhou dynasty. In terms of the most fundamental framework of moral action, the ordinary practice of filiality, or obedient service to parents. Their world-shaping accomplishments are represented as no more than the ultimate extension of filial service, linking the moral life of every person to the unimaginable perfection of these sages. Take a short break here. Taken together, sections 1 to 3 share a stress on the topic of the common root of all moral practice, from the most ordinary everyday action to the grandest political achievements. The common farmer and his wife practicing the Tao without knowing it, chapter 12. And the greatest sages are simply filial children, like all of us, chapters 17 to 19. Section 14, chapter 20, parts A and B, begins with a break in the flow of the text. For the only time in the text we hear a personal voice other than the narrator's or Confucius's, that of Duke I of Lu, who asks about the practical issue of governance. Section 4a is Confucius's response, and his answer is that the key to governance lies in placing in positions of power people who have grasped the Tao, Junzis, in short, the superior virtuous men, Junzas. Giving virtue the lead is the way the world is set in order. A longer quotation from Confucius follows, section 4b, spelling out 9 canons of governance. These are something like a great learning, Daxue for rulers, tracing the steps from self-perfection to perfecting one's relationship to an ever-widening circle of people until the entire world and cosmos falls within your circle of concern. Entire world, rather. Okay, so we saw that famous passage in the Daxue where it says, start by making yourself, setting yourself in order, making yourself virtuous, then move on to your family, to your kids, to your wife, and then outward to your town, village, and then outward from there to the empire. Section 5, chapter 20, part C, through chapter 26, is in many ways the climax of the text as a whole. It begins with passages found in the Mencius, the Mengzi, providing a transition from political relationships back to a focus on the individual, where the root of all success is found in the force of perfect genuineness, Chang. Genuineness, Chang, is the theme of the entire section. So section 5 is about genuineness. It is pictured not merely as a vector of moral understanding and action in people, endowed within them by Tian as their distinguishing nature, or Qing, and as their intended destiny. So it is not that. It is pictured not that, but it is the creative force of the cosmos itself, a human expression of the teleological unfolding of the world of things and affairs. This is where the text most clearly links the ethics of Mengzi, Mencius, to the metaphysics of Junza, who saw the birth of the human species as Tian's final creative act. So underline Junza, and we'll go over that in the study guide later, and we'll go over that in class. Tian's final creative act, the generation of an independent sage capacity which could complete the order of the cosmos and fulfill its destiny. Chapter 22 reads, quote, Only those in the world who are perfectly genuine to the utmost can exhaust their natures. Perfectly genuine. Perfectly cheng. Those who can exhaust their natures can exhaust others' natures. Those who can exhaust others' natures can exhaust the natures of things. Those who can exhaust the nature of things can participate in the nurturing transformations of Tian. Those who can participate in the nurturing transformations of Tian can form a triad with heaven and earth. So the sentence structure, formulaic sentence structure, we already saw in the Daxue, and it's being used again here. We see this a lot in Confucian texts, this use of repetition and sort of building on what preceded it logically. The outcome of acting as a end quote. The outcome of acting as a creative force on par with nature, forming a triad with heaven and earth. Yu Tian Di Zhang. Yu Tian Di Zhang. Yeah, Tenqi is Tian Di, I was right, about heaven and earth. A formula found repeatedly in the Junza is here rooted in Mencius's precept of exhausting one's nature. Jingqi Xing. Section 6, chapters 27 to 29, translates this image of co-creation between heaven, earth, and human beings to the social world, where its emblem is ritual, li, which is the sort of central idea or term in the Li Zhi, the Book of Rites. So li is translated as ritual or rites. That is the networks of human convention that sage creators elaborated as the enduring social expressions of human nature. This too is a theme far more characteristic of Junza than Mencius. The Junza conveys a similar notion in this phrasing. Quote from the Junza, "In the heavens nothing shines more brightly than the sun and moon. On earth nothing shines more brightly than water and fire. Among objects nothing shines more brightly than pearls and jade. Amidst humanity, nothing shines more brightly than ritual, li, and propriety, also li." Or possibly gaku, naku. I'll have to check on that, what it says in the original. Section 7. Li Shui. Alright, Section 7, chapters 30 to 32, celebrates the sage who brings the three realms of heaven, earth, and humankind together, praising first the former kings, whom Confucius took as models, namely the Zhou kings, the legendary Zhou kings, who were the embodiment of perfect virtue in Confucius's mind. And then the general character of the sage, who is described as the apotheosis of humanity, performing as a cosmic actor. The Coda, chapter 33, closes the argument with a long string of poetic passages interpreted as invoking the invisible, transformative power of the cosmic age. These sectional divisions, listed below with Juxi's corresponding chapter divisions, indicated, so remember it was Juxi, the Neo-Confucian scholar of the 12th century, Song Dynasty, who took this work out of its original context, the Li Ji, and made it its own independent work and included it in the 4 books, the Sishu, and he's the one who came up with this sectional divisions, chapter divisions. So Professor Eno follows his divisions. Are provisional and particular to this translation. They are not part of any commentarial tradition. Okay, let's read that again. These sectional divisions, listed below with Juxi's corresponding chapter divisions indicated, are provisional and particular to this translation. Okay, so the sectional divisions are those that Professor Eno came up with. They are not part of any commentarial tradition and are provided solely as guides to readers in following what seem to be the general contours of the sustained argument of the Zhongyong doctrine of the mean. And his sectional divisions are as follows. The theme is the first part, the source of the center. The section 1, chapters 2 to 11, cleaving to the central mean, is the thematic title he gave to that. Section 2, he calls the common basis of the Tao, chapters 12 to 16. Section 3, Confucius on the sages and filial perfection, chapters 17 to 19. Section 4 he calls On Government, which is chapter 20, parts A and B. Section 5 he calls Perfect Genuineness, or Cheng, part C, from chapter 20, part C to chapter 26. Section 6, Ruling by the Tao of Nature and Li, 27 to 29 chapters. And section 7 is he calls the Sage's Power of Virtue, chapters 30 to 32. And then the Coda at the very end, chapter 33, which he calls the Invisibility of Ultimate Greatness. Alright. And now that's the end of his introduction. So I'm battling something of a cold right now. Professor Ino's introduction ends there, and then then we have his translation, which I will now proceed to read in full. The Doctrine of the Mean, Zhongyong, translated by Professor Robert Ino. Okay, the Doctrine of the Mean, Zhongyong. Remember, it's about twice as long as the Daxue. First part is the theme, the source of the center. And keep in mind that there are copious notes in the margins provided by Professor Ino. I'm not going to read them here. We will read them in class. And there are sort of explanations of the key terms, such as Tian, Dao, Junza. And he provides a glossary at the end. So I'll read his terms that are included in the glossary at the end, so we can review and make sure we understand them all. 1. Chapter 1. That which is ordained by Tian, heaven, is called our nature, Xing. To lead by our nature, Xing, is called the Tao, the path, the way. To cultivate the Tao is called the teaching. One may not deviate from the Tao for so much as an instant. That from which one may deviate is not the Tao. Thus the Junza, the superior virtuous man, is alert and cautious about what he does not see, is fearful about what he does not hear. Nothing is more visible than the obscure, nothing is plainer than the subtle. Hence the Junza is cautious in his solitude. Pleasure and anger, sorrow and joy, before they emerge, they are called centered. Emerging by the proper rhythms, they are called harmonious. Centered, Zhong. This is the great root of the world. Alright. Harmonious. This is the ultimate Tao of the world. Reaching centered harmony, heaven and earth take their proper places, and the things of the world are nurtured thereby. Section 1. Cleaving to the central mean. So cleaving to the Zhong. Confucius said, quote, the Junza keeps to the mean, the Zhong, in action. The small man reverses the mean in action. The mean of the Junza is such that he is always exact in his timeliness. The reversal of the mean of the small man is such that he will scruple at nothing. Okay, so small man, the Xiaoren, and the Junza are antithetical ideas in Confucius. Keep that in mind whenever you see small man, the Xiaoren. The master said, the mean in action is the ultimate. Few among the people can cleave to it, can long cleave to it. Okay, so only the Junza is able to cleave to it for a long period. 4. The master said, quote, that the Tao will not be put into practice, I know it. The wise go beyond it, and the ignorant do not reach it. That the Tao will not be made brilliant, I know it. The worthy go beyond it, and the unworthy do not reach it. No one does not eat, but few can know the taste. Okay, there's lots of notes and commentary in the margins. We'll go over that in class. Moving on. The master said, the Tao is not put into practice. Next. The master said, how great was the wisdom of Shun. So Shun is one of the legendary rulers of the distant past, often cited as an example of perfect sagehood. Shun loved to ask questions and loved to inquire into teachings near at hand. He put evil in the shadow and raised up good. He grasped both ends but employed the center in ruling the people. Was this not Shun? Next, Master said, quote, "Men all say I am wise. Drive them into a net or catch them tumbling into a trap. None knows how to evade them. Men all say I am wise, but let them choose the mean, the zhong, in action, and none can keep to it for around a month." 8. The master said, Hui, Yang Hui, he was a disciple of Confucius, regarded as being of highest moral attainment. The master said, Yang Hui was a man who, having chosen to cleave to the mean in action, would clutch any point of goodness tight in his fist, press it to his heart, and never lose it. Next, the master said, quote, "One may level all the states of the world, decline high rank and salary, tread upon naked blades, and yet be unable to cleave to the mean in ordinary practice." The cleaving to the mean in ordinary practice is, according to Confucius, the hardest thing to do. It's the thing that humans should do but fail to do, hence the chaotic state of the world. 10. The next one. Zilu asked about strength. The master said, quote, "The strength of the south or the strength of the north? Or do you mean your type of strength? Instructing through leniency, not responding in kind to unjust acts. Such is the strength of the south. The Junza dwells in this. To sleep in one's armor, to die unflinchingly. Such is the strength of the north. Your type of strong man dwells in this." So Zilu was one of Confucius's senior disciples, known for his impetuous valor. And Confucius continues, "The Junza acts harmoniously, but does not join in vulgarity, the strength of the strong. He stands at the center and does not lean, the strength of the strong. When the state possesses the Tao, he is unchanged from when his way was blocked, the strength of the strong. When the state is without Tao, he remains unchanged even though it means death, the strength of the strong." Next, the master said, "Those who seek to live in hiding and practice strange arts will still be spoken of in later ages. But I do not do these things. A Junza may guide his way with respect to the Tao and fall by the wayside midway, but I cannot cease. A Junza may cleave to the mean in action by fleeing from the world, but to live unknown and feel no regret is something only a sage can do." So in this passage we see Confucius picturing the Junza as a lesser ideal in contrast to the sage. So the sage is a higher order, or higher rank of the human. Section 2. The common basis of the Tao. The Tao of the Junza is broad yet hidden. Any husband or wife may partake in knowledge of it, yet reaching to its ultimate nature, there is that which even the sage does not know of it. Even an unworthy husband or wife may practice of it, yet reaching to its ultimate nature, there is that of which even the sage cannot practice. Heaven and earth are great indeed, yet there are still those things which lead men to despair in them. So it is that when the Junza speaks of what is great, there is nothing in the world that can bear it up. Yet when he speaks of what is small, there is nothing in the world that can split it. The poetry, the Shi or Shijing, one of the 5 classic texts, says, quote from the Shi, "The kite flies high, striking the heavens. The fish leap in the abyssal depths. And the book of poetry, of course, is an early anthology of verse, celebrated as a classic source of sage wisdom by Confucians, and we'll go over it again in the glossary. The Doctrine of the Mean cites from 18 of the poetry's 305 odes, so the 305 odes included in the Shi, and this work cites from 18 of them. That is to say that both high and low are fully delved. The Tao of the Junza forges its basis on the common husband and wife, yet reaching to its ultimate nature, it delves into heaven and earth. Next, 13. The Master said, "The Tao does not depart from the man. If a man creates a Tao that departs far from others, it cannot be taken as the Tao." Okay, so I think this might be an implicit criticism of the Taoists, who kind of leave humanity and leave society and leave all its norms and conventions and go into the forests or the woods or wherever and pursue their own desires and art and so forth in their small little circles of hippies, abandoning their fellow men. And he's sort of critiquing that here by saying, the Tao does not depart far from man. If a man creates a Tao that departs far from others, it cannot be taken as the Tao. The poetry, the Shi, says, when cutting an axe handle, the model is never far. Is the end of the quote from the poetry. Say you hold an axe handle to cut an axe handle, but glance aside when looking at the handle in your grasp. That would be to treat it as a distant thing. The Junza governs humans by means of what is human, and once they are reformed, he stops. Devotion and reciprocity are not far from the Tao. If you would be willing to have something done to you, do not do it to others. Okay, so there's the golden rule that appears. Confucianism is often described as a golden rule religion or philosophy, because it includes this. I think this similar passage appears in the Analects of Confucius as well. If you would be unwilling to have something to do to you, do not do it to others. Okay, this is the idea of reciprocity. Shu, which we saw in the Daxue, kind of difficult character that looks like okoru in Japanese, do. And this is the idea of devotion and reciprocity. Zhong is devotion, reciprocity, Shu are identified in the Analects too, as I just mentioned in chapter 4.15, as the unifying thread of Confucius' teaching. The golden rule maxim given here appears as in Analects 15:24 as a formula for reciprocity alone, is what Eno has in his note there. Continuing. There are 4 aspects to the Tao of the Junza. Not one am I able to fulfill. To serve my father with that which I seek from my son, I cannot do it. To serve my ruler with that which I seek from my subordinates, I cannot do it. To serve my elders with that which I seek from my juniors, I cannot do it. To first practice towards my friends what I seek from them, I cannot do it. In the practice of common virtue, in exercising care in normal speech, if you fall short, dare not fail to exert yourself. If you overstep, do not carry on to the end. In speaking, look to your action. In action, look towards your speech. How can a Junza fail to ever be alert? Okay, let's take a break here before we move on to section 14 of this chapter. Okay, we're going to have to pick up the pace so we can get through the end of this. 14. The Junza simply acts according to his position. He does not long for what is outside of it. If he is naturally in a position of wealth and high status, he acts according to the norms of wealth and high status. Okay, so the Junza can be from any class. He doesn't have to be born into the aristocracy. He just must act according to his position, he's saying here. He acts according to the norms of wealth and high status if he is born into that class. If he is naturally in a position of poverty and low status, he acts according to the norms of poverty and low status. So you can have a Junza who is poor and born into the lower classes. If he is naturally placed among the nomad tribes, he acts according to the norms of the nomad tribes. If he is naturally placed amidst confusion and trouble, he acts as if appropriate for times of confusion and trouble, namely times of war and so forth. So there's no set prescribed norms for the Junza. He must act in accordance to his own times and into the class, social class that he's born into and so forth. There is no situation in which the Junza is not fully self-possessed. When in high position, do not be arrogant towards those below. When in low position, do not prevail upon those above. Make yourself upright and do not seek what you wish in others. Then you will encounter no resentments. Above, do not bear resentments towards Tien. Below, do not blame men. Hence the Junza dwells in what is simple, awaiting his destiny. The small man engages in precipitous practices in search of a lucky fortune. Okay, so I don't know if Nietzsche ever read anything, any of the classics of Confucianism, but there's some echoes of Confucius in Nietzsche's works, I think, especially his idea of amor fati, for example. You can almost hear echoes of amor fati here in this passage. Okay, and there's a note about this passage bearing some resemblances to another similar passage in the Analects. We'll go over that in class. The master said, "There is in archery that which resembles the Junza. Should one miss the target, he seeks for the cause within himself." Okay, so this archery metaphor, which is, of course, the same metaphor that we see in the idea of sin in the West, right? Hamartia. I think is how it's pronounced in Greek. The Greek word for sin is hamartia, which literally means to miss the mark. And we see something similar here. When you miss the mark, the cause for that lies within oneself. So the Junza should look in himself and figure out why he missed the mark when he did. Alright. 15. The Tao of the Junza may be compared to the saying that a distant journey must begin from nearby, that a climb to great heights must begin from below. The Shi Jing, the poetry, says, "Wife and children in loving concert, like zither strings all thrummed, brothers all in unison, in happy harmony and joy. How sound your household! Take joy in wife and offspring." And music and joy, of course, are the same kanji character, yue fu to yue, right? In Chinese, gaku in Japanese, music, the kanji can mean music or joy. The master said, "How these parents have acted in accord." 16. Okay. And there's a little note about this. The common religion of early China was ancestral worship through ritual sacrifice. The spirits of the dead were understood to descend and partake of the food and wine, though they left much unconsumed. Okay, this, of course, comes into Japan. It may originate in Japan before the continental influence, so ignore that comment, actually. 16. The master said, "How abundant is the virtue of ghosts and spirits! You look at them and do not see, listen to them and do not hear. Yet they inhabit affairs without exception. They make all the people of the world fast and don ritual robes in offering up sacrifices. Thrilling, how they seem to hover above, how they seem to be at every side. The Shi, poetry, says, the arrival of the spirits cannot be anticipated, much less may one be remiss. The plain clarity of the subtle. In just this way, perfect genuineness cannot be obscured." So underline this word here, perfect genuineness, the key term that I mentioned in the introduction, Chang, right? And he returns to the subject of perfect genuineness, or Chang, later. Section 3 now we're in. This is the Confucius on the sages and filial perfection. So this is about filial piety, obeying your parents. Very one of the cardinal virtues of Confucian ethics. 17. Section 3, part 17. The master said, Did not Shun, remember Shun is one of the legendary kings from old, Yao and Shun. Did not Shun fulfill great filiality? His virtue was that of a sage. He was exalted as the son of heaven. We saw this earlier in the Daxue, the son of heaven, the one who rules over the realm. Did not Shun fulfill his great filiality? His virtue was that of a sage. He was exalted as the son of heaven. His wealth was the possession of all within the four seas. His ancestors were feasted by him at the clan shrines, and his descendants protected them. Three passages, 6 numbers. Alright, so yes, this is a passage that is revering the legendary King Shun of the Zhou Empire. Continuing, thus it is that great virtue inevitably gains its proper position, inevitably gains its proper stipend, inevitably gains its proper fame, inevitably gains its proper longevity. Thus it is that when Tian, heaven, gives birth to a thing, it treats it with generosity according to its potential. Hence, when plants are cultivated, they should be nurtured, but when they lean askance, they should be cut down. The poetry says, alright, Shun, by the way, the legendary Shun of the Zhou dynasty, was particularly celebrated in the Mencius tradition for his filial virtue. Keep that in mind whenever you see Shun. Okay, so the poetry says, the Junza of great goodness, how abundant his fine virtue, fit for the people, fit for all the others. He receives his stipend from Tian, which protects and assists him with the mandate, the Ming, extended from Tian. Thus great virtue inevitably receives the mandate. Okay, and there's a note in the glossary about the mandate, so I'll explain that below, the Ming. 18 now. The master said, utterly without care, would this not characterize King Wen? His father was King Zhi, his son was King Wu. His father initiated it, his son continued it. So there's a note that says, the historical exemplars in this passage are all connected with the founding of the Zhou royal lineage as the dynastic ruling house of China after its conquest of the Shang dynasty in 1045 BC. Alright, so I mentioned in the last video, but if you're not familiar with the chronology of Chinese history, Chinese dynastic history, and its major dynasties, click on the link that I have in the description below, and there's a famous song set to Frère Jacques, but with the lyrics of the song replaced with the major dynasties of Chinese history, and it's a very good tool for memorizing them. So if you haven't memorized the chronology of Chinese history, memorize it now, so you immediately can place the dates whenever you hear these dynasties mentioned. The Zhou is, of course, the very distant antiquity. All right. His son was King Wu, his father, and his son continued it. Continuing, King Wu extended the thread from King Tai, King Zhi, and King Wen. As soon as he donned the clothes of war, the world was his. His brilliant fame in the world was never diminished. He was exalted as the son of heaven. His wealth was the possession of all within the four seas. His ancestors were feasted by him at the clan shrines, and his descendants protected them. In the end, King Wu received the mandate. The Duke of Zhou, who's Confucius often mentions as the prime exemplar of virtue. The Duke of Zhou perfected the virtue of Wang and Wu. He conferred posthumous royal titles on King Tai and King Zhi, and in sacrifices to the former lords he employed the rituals for the Son of Heaven. This rule is then extended to the patrician lords, the grandees, and the common people. If the father is a grandee and the son a mere knight, bury the father as a grandee, sacrifice to him as a knight. If the father is a knight and the son a grandee, bury the father as a knight, sacrifice him as a grandee. The mourning period of a year is extended to all grandees. The mourning period of 3 years applies to the Son of Heaven, but when mourning a parent, there are no distinctions of rank. All are the same. Alright, continuing. Continue this theme of filial piety. The master said, King Wu and the Duke of Zhou, were they not of ultimate filiality? The filial son extends well the intentions of his father and carries out his father's affairs. In spring and autumn he repairs the ancestral shrines, sets out the ancestral vessels, lays out the ancestral robes, and offers up the food of the season. The rituals of the ancestral shrines are the means of ordering the lines of descent, alternating the generations of Zhao and Mu. The ordering of ritual ranks distinguishes the exalted from the humble. In ordering the ceremonial affairs, distinctions reflect degrees of worthiness. In the rituals of toasting, superiors toast inferiors, extending the rights to the humble. In the closing banquet, the white-haired take the places of honor, to represent ordering by age, to occupy his post, to carry out his rituals, to perform his music, to respect what he honored, to love what he cherished, to treat the dead as one treats the living, to treat the departed as one treats those who remain. This is the ultimate of filiality. The suburban rite of sacrifice ministers to the Lord on high. The rituals of the ancestral shrines minister to one's forebears. He who comprehends the rite of the suburban sacrifice, or the meaning of the great spring and autumn sacrifices, can rule a state as though it lay in his palm. The suburban rite, it says here in the notes, was an outdoor sacrifice offered to the high god, variously called the Lord on High, a Shang dynasty term, and Tian, a Zhou dynasty term. Alright, that's the end of the filial piety section and the sages section, the great sages of old of the Zhou dynasty section. And now we move on to section 4 on government. Take a break here. Continue from section 4, chapter 20. Alright. Chapter 20. Chapter 20 is very long and has multiple themes, broken into subsections here. The first 3 comprising a discussion of the Tao of governance. Section 4 on government, chapter 20a. Duke I inquired about governing. The master said, the governance of kings Weng and Wu is laid out in the bound records. When men such as these live, such governance is implemented. After they die, it withers away. If the Tao of humankind is it is the Tao of humankind to be quick at government, as the Tao of earth is to be quick at growing things. Governments grow like the rushes. The success at Duke I of Lu reigned from 494 to 465 BC. The success of a government thus lies in the men it chooses. In selecting men, judge by your own person. Refine your person by means of the Tao. Refine the Tao by means of humanity. And it says here in the notes that Mencian thought, so the thought of Mencius, prioritizes virtue in people over correctness of rules. Because Mencius, of course, thought humans were good, and that they have this innate virtue within them that needs to be cultivated. The success in selecting men, judge by your own person. Refine your person by the means of the Tao. Refine the Tao by means of humanity. Humanity, ren, means human, ren. Okay, and there's a note here that says humanity, ren, the Confucian virtue of ren is humanity or humaneness or benevolence. It's sometimes translated as empathy or sympathy. It might be translated as well. Is a cognate word with human, ren, people, right? They have the same sound pronunciation, and they are obviously related. Humanity means human. Cleaving to one's kin is its foremost element. Rite means appropriate. Rite, of course, is yi, another of the four cardinal Confucian virtues. Rite means appropriate. Honoring the worthy is its foremost element. The degrees that govern cleaving to one's kin and the ranks that govern honoring the worthy are the things that give birth to ritual. Okay, so underline rite here. We'll go over this in class. These virtues of ren and yi, which are very important words in Confucian thought. Hence, the Junza cannot fail to refine his person. Intending to refine his person, he cannot fail to minister to his parents. Intending to minister to his parents, he cannot fail to understand others. Intending to understand others, he cannot fail to understand Tian, or the heaven. Alright, so humanity, ren, and humid are cognate words. Mention thought stressed that all human beings had an innate disposition to be humane. Right, or righteousness, yi, and appropriate were near homophones. Okay, we'll go over that again in the glossary at the end of this text. There are 5 things that extend throughout the world and 3 means of practicing them: ruler and minister, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger brother, friend meeting friend. These 5 form a universal Tao for the world. Wisdom, humanity, valor. These 3 form the universal virtues for the world. There is but a single means of putting them into practice. Some are born understanding it, some study to understand it, some come to understand it only in circumstances of duress, but once they understand it, they are all one. Some practice it through natural ease, some practice it to benefit thereby, some practice it by forcing themselves. But once they succeed by means of it, they are all one. B. The master said, loving learning is close to wisdom. Assiduous practice is close to humanity, ren. Knowing shame is close to valor. He who knows these 3 things knows how to refine his person. He who knows how to refine his person knows how to rule others. He who knows how to rule others knows how to rule the states of the world. So again, starting with the personal, with the individual, and working out from there to the cultivation of the and perfection of the world, after perfecting oneself. These are 9 canons for ruling the states of the world. Refine your person, honor the worthy, cleave to your kin, respect high ministers, empathize with all officers, treat the common people as your children, attract the skilled craftsmen, treat those different from you with gentleness, cherish the patrician lords. As it says here in the notes, this is a formula for a unified rule over China. The empire was divided into many states, ruled by patrician lords after 771, until reunification. First under the Qing dynasty in 221 BC. The Qing dynasty is when China was sort of reunited for the first time and formed a single unit. And the word China comes from this Qing dynasty. And then Han, royal houses. The note is long, we'll go over that in class later. And continuing. There are 9 canons for ruling the states of the world. Refine your person. We already read this. Okay. When your person is refined, the Tao is established. When you honor the worthy, you become free from confusion. When you cleave to your kin, your father, uncles, and brothers will have no complaint against you. When you respect your high ministers, you will not be deceived. When you empathize with all your officers, gentlemen will respond with great ritual courtesies. When you treat the common people as your children, the people will exhort one another. When you attract the skilled craftsmen, you will have a sufficiency of goods. When you treat those distant from you with gentleness, the 4 quarters will flock to you. When you cherish the patrician lords, then the world will be in awe of you. Continuing, fasting and purification, the ritual robes. No movement not in accord with ritual. This is the means to purify your person. ridding yourself of flatterers and keeping sexual attractions at a distance, treating goods as cheap and virtue as dear. This is the means to encourage the worthy, exalting their positions and providing generous emoluments, loving and hating as they love and hate. This is the means to encourage your kin. Well-staffed offices with adequate responsibilities. This is the means to encourage high ministers. Devotion and trustworthiness, generous emoluments. This is the means to encourage gentlemen. Seasonable labor, service, and light taxation. This is the means to encourage the common people. Daily supervision and monthly reviews. Provisions corresponding to works. This is the means to encourage skilled craftsmen. Welcoming them when they come and sending them off when they depart, with praise for their accomplishments and compassion for their inabilities. This is the means to be gentle with those distant. Restoring lines of broken succession, and reviving abolished states, ordering chaos and supporting those in danger, setting regular times for their visits to court, asking they bring little when they come and sending them off with much. This is the means of cherishing the patrician lords. These are all the 9 canons for ruling the states of the world. There is but a single means of putting them all into practice. In all things, when plans are well laid, stand by them. When they are not, discard them. When words are settled in advance, there is no stumbling. When affairs are settled in advance, there are no tight straits. When actions are settled in advance, there is no flaw. When the Tao is settled in advance, it is inexhaustible. Okay, that's the end of section 4. Now we have section 5, which is on perfect genuineness. This idea of Chang Makoto in Japanese is the kanji for it. And we'll take a quick break before we continue with section 5. Okay, let's read this as quickly as possible so we can get through sections 5 and 6 before I pass out. Section 5, perfect genuineness. Chang. If those in inferior positions do not gain the trust of their superiors, the people cannot be ruled. There is a Tao to gaining the trust of superiors. If you are not faithful to friends, you will not gain the trust of your superiors. There is a Tao to being faithful to friends. If you are not obedient to your parents, you will not be faithful to your friends. There is a Tao to being obedient to your parents. If in reflecting upon yourself you are not perfectly genuine, you will not be obedient to your parents. There is a Tao to perfecting your genuineness. If you are not clear about the good, you will not perfect your genuineness. Perfect genuineness is the Tao of Tian. So Cheng is the Tao of Tian. Making things perfectly genuine is the Tao of Ren, humankind. Also humaneness. One who is perfectly genuine, one who is perfectly Cheng, hits the mark, so again the archery metaphor, without effort, succeeds without forethought. To keep to the center of the Tao at perfect ease is to be a sage. One who makes things perfectly genuine is one who chooses the good and invariably grasps it tight. Study broadly. Inquire probingly. Contemplate carefully. Distinguish clearly. Practice sincerely. If there remain things unstudied, do not act upon what you have not mastered. If there remain things unprobed, do not act upon what you do not understand. If there remain things uncontemplated, do not act upon what you have not grasped. If there remain aspects indistinct, do not act upon what is not clear to you. If there remain aspects unpracticed, do not act upon what you cannot sincerely do. When others can do one, demand that you do 100. When others can do 10, demand that you do 1,000. He who fully masters this Tao, though ignorant, shall surely become enlightened. Though weak, shall surely become strong. Okay, so make the standards that you apply to yourself higher than those that you apply to others. I think it's basically what he's saying here. Continuing. Spontaneously genuine in clarity. It is this that we refer to as our Xing, our nature. Spontaneously clarifying genuineness. It is this that we refer to as the teaching. So genuineness, again, Cheng. If one is perfectly Cheng or genuine, one will have clarity. If one has clarity, then one will be perfectly Cheng, genuine. Continuing, only those in the world who are perfectly Cheng, genuine to the utmost can exhaust their Qing natures. Those who can exhaust their Qing natures can exhaust others' natures. Those who can exhaust here is like the Japanese tsukusu, by the way. It means to fulfill to the utmost. Those who can fulfill to the utmost or exhaust others' Qing can exhaust the natures of things. Those who can exhaust the natures of things can participate in the nurturing transformations of Tian, heaven. Those who can participate in the nurturing transformations of Tian, or heaven or nature, can form a triad with heaven and earth. 23. The next best is to master a single aspect. If one can perfect Cheng or genuineness in one aspect, that genuineness will appear in one's form. Appearing in one's form, it will become plain. Becoming plain, it will shine forth. Shining forth, it will move. Moving, it will responsively change. Responsively changing, it will transform things. Only those in the world who are perfectly genuine to the utmost can transform things. There's a note about that. We'll go over it in class. 24. Through the Tao of being perfectly Cheng, genuine, one may possess foreknowledge. When a state is about to flourish, there must be auspicious omens. When a state is about to perish, there must be omens of its demise. Just as these omens become manifest through milfoil and turtle shell, so remember milfoil and turtle shell are used in traditional divination ceremonies. Just as these omens become manifest through milfoil and turtle shell, so for such a one they course through his four limbs. When blessings or disasters are about to arrive, if it is good, he will surely know it first. If it is bad, he will surely know it first. 25. Perfect genuineness, perfect Cheng, spontaneously completes things. The Tao spontaneously guides them. Perfect genuineness is the cycle of things ending and beginning anew. Without genuineness, without Cheng, there would be no things. And things here refers to the affairs in the world, human situations, Wu in Chinese. For this reason, the Junza treats perfect genuineness as of greatest value. Perfect Cheng, perfect genuineness is not merely the perfection of oneself, it is the means of perfecting all things. Perfecting oneself is humanity, Ren. Perfecting things is wisdom, Chū. If the virtue, the De of our nature, Xing, to conjoin, it is the virtue of our nature to conjoin the Tao of inner and outer. Hence it is applied with the appropriateness of timeliness. 26, here we have mention of Wu Wei, or taking no action, which is often associated with Taoist texts, especially the Tao Te Ching. It appears once in the Analects as well. The Lunyu has one instance of this phrase, the Wu Wei, to denote the action of the perfect ruler, Shun, who acts by not acting, and it seems both there and here to represent a targeted co-optation of Taoist rhetoric. Okay, so keep that in mind as we read this section 26, this chapter 26. Hence the utmost of perfect genuineness, Cheng, never ceases. Never ceasing, it endures. Enduring, it is manifest. Manifest, it reaches distant. Reaching distant, it is broad and deep. Broad and deep, it is high and bright. Broad and deep is that which bears all things. High and bright is that which covers all things. Distant and enduring, it is that which completes things. Broad and deep, complementing earth. High and bright, complementing heaven. Distant and enduring without end. One who is like this glimmers though unseen, changes through though unmoving, achieves though taking no action. So achieves though Wu Wei, taking no action. The Tao of heaven and earth may be thoroughly described in a single phrase. As a thing, it possesses no duality, hence the way it gives birth to things cannot be fathomed. The Tao of heaven and earth is broad, is deep, is high, is bright, is distant, is enduring. Now heaven is but the composite of many tiny lights, but when it extends to its endlessness, it suspends the sun, moon, planets, and stars, and the world of things covered by it. Earth is but the composite of many pinches of soil, but when it extends to its breadth and depth, it carries the peaks of Hua and Yue, which are mountains in central China, upon it without their being heavy. It bears the rivers and seas upon it without their leaking away, and all the world of things is borne upon it. A mountain is but the composite of many round stones, but as it grows to its breadth and greatness, grasses and trees are borne upon it. Birds and beasts dwell upon it, and precious jewels arise within it. A river is but the composite of many dipperfuls of water, but as it reaches its unfathomable depth, turtles and lizards, dragons and fish are born within it, and goods are increased by sailing above it. The Shi Jing, or poetry, says, quote, "The mandate of Tian, the Tian Ming, ah, how endless! Surely speaking of the manner in which Tian is heavenly. O glimmering," so again quoting from the poetry, "O glimmering, the purity of King Wen's virtue, surely meaning that the manner in which King Wen was patterned lay in endless purity." Here's a note about King Wen's posthumous name, Wen, denoted the patterns of civilization expressed through the many forms of li, that is, formal ritual and ordinary social ceremony or etiquette. So keep in mind again that li is to nature as Weng is to human, the human realm, as I noted on Twitter the other day. All right. So Weng is the principles or the patterns that humans make. Li, analogously, is the patterns or principles that nature or heaven makes. All right. That's the end of section 5. And now for the final section, section 6, ruling by the Tao of nature and ritual. So I think this last section is kind of the culmination of this whole work, so we'll take a little break and then get back to it immediately. Okay, the final section. Section 6, ruling by the Tao of nature and ritual. How great is the Tao of the sage! Brimming, it nurtures the things of the world, and towering, reaches the pole of heaven. Enormous is it in its hugeness. The ceremonies of ritual number 300, and the ceremonies of etiquette number 3,000. All await the right man before they can be put into practice. Thus it is said, if one does not extend virtue, the ultimate Tao will not coalesce therein. Hence the Junza honors the virtuous nature and takes learning as his Tao. He extends to the broadest expanse and exhausts the essence of the minute. He reaches to the pole of the high and bright and takes the mean in action as his Tao. He breathes warmth. There's a note about breathing warmth from the Analects. He breathes warmth into the old and understands the new, and is deeply sincere in his exaltation of ritual. Thus, when he occupies the superior role, he is not arrogant, and in the inferior role, he is not insubordinate. When the state possesses the Tao, so I should make a note here that Confucianism is often thought of as a very hierarchical sort of system or philosophy, which it is, or having a hierarchical understanding of how social relationships should be constructed, and that's all true, but there's a kind of fluidity between these hierarchical relationships. The person on the bottom shouldn't be just always in an inferior role, and the person in the top must not be arrogant, and occasionally if the person on the bottom sees that the person on the top is not fulfilling his duty, he is allowed to rebel and overthrow that ruler, right? So there's a lot of sort of caveats and conditions that Confucius gives in the Analects to these relationships, right? So it's not as rigid as it is often characterized as. All right, continuing. Thus, when he occupies a superior role, he is not arrogant. The inferior role, he is not insubordinate. When the state possesses the Tao, his counsel can raise it up high. When the state does not possess the Tao, his silence can accommodate it. The poetry says, the Shi Jing says, both bright and shining, so guarding his person. Does it not mean this precisely? Chapter 28. The master said, ignorant yet fond of acting by his own lights, of low station yet fond of relying only on himself, born in this generation and returning to the Tao of old, disaster will surely reach such as these. If one is not the son of heaven, one does not discuss matters of ritual. One does not delineate a system of rules and measures. One does not make assessments of patterns of culture. In the world of today, carts are built with axles of standard length. Texts are written in script of standard style. Conduct is performed in roles of standard form. Though one occupies the office, if one lacks the virtue, one must not presume to innovate ritual and music, li shui. Though one possess the virtue, one possess the de, rather, I think I said D earlier. For virtue, it's de, Tao De Jing de de. Though one possess the de, virtue, if one lacks the office, one must also not presume to innovate ritual and music, li yue, sorry. Yue for the yue. The master said, I can describe the ritual of the xia, but the state of qi is insufficient to confirm this. I have studied the ritual of the yin. The state of song preserves them. I have studied the ritual of the Zhou dynasty, the inaugurating dynasty. We now use them, and we follow the Zhou. So xia, yin is an alternative name for the Shang dynasty. Keep that in mind whenever you see Ying dynasty. It's the same as Shang dynasty. So the xia is the sort of very distant and ancient dynasty, and Zhou are the dynasties of the past. The three eras are often called the Xia, Ying, or Shang, and the Zhou dynasty. The descendants of the Xia and Shang lived in the states of Qi and Song. Okay. The master said I can describe the ritual, but the state of Qi is insufficient to confirm this. I have studied the ritual of the Ying, the state of Song preserves them. I have studied the ritual of the Zhou, and we now use them, and we follow the Zhou. Okay, chapter 29 now. In ruling the world, if one attends to the three weighty matters, there's some controversy over what this three weighty matters refers to, one's errors will be few. If the former rituals, though good, lack confirmation, then lacking confirmation they will not be trusted, and not being trusted, the people will not follow them. If the latter rituals, though good, are not honored, then in not being honored they will not be trusted, and in not being trusted the people will not follow them. Thus, the Tao of the Junza is rooted in his own person, confirmed in the common people, assessed against the kings of the three eras, all without flaw. The three eras mentioned above, the three eras of old, the three founding eras of Chinese civilization. Then, when established within heaven and earth, it is not rejected. When put to examination by the ghosts and spirits, it is not doubted. When put to examinations by the ghosts and spirit, it is not doubted. If one could await its employment by a sage 100 generations hence, he could apply it and be without confusion. When put to examination by the ghosts and spirits, it is not doubted. Quote, such is its understanding of Tian. If one could await its employment by a sage 100 generations hence, he could apply it and be without confusion. Such is its understanding of man. Thus the motion of a Junza can be the Tao of the world for every generation. His actions can be the model of the world for every generation. His words can be the standard of the world for every generation. Those from whom he is distant will gaze towards him. Those towards whom he draws near will never grow tired of him. The poetry, the Shi Jing, says, over there none hate him, over here none weary of him, unceasing day and night, ever praising him to the end. End quote from the Shi Jing. Never has there been a Junza who has failed to be like this, yet it has prematurely earned praise in the world. Alright. I lied. Section 6 is not the end. There's section 7, I forgot. Okay, this is the final section. Section 7, the Tian-like virtue of the sage. Confucius recounted Yao and Shun. Remember that Yao and Shun are, according to the Warring States era Confucian legend, civilization's initial kings. Okay, so Confucius recounted the legendary kings Yao and Shun as ancestral. He emblazoned Wen and Wu as regulating models. And Wen and Wu were the kings credited with delineating the institutions of the Zhou state. Above, they took the seasons of heaven as rule. Below, they accorded with the flow of the waters and lands. This may be compared to heaven and earth. Nothing do they fail to bear or to cover. This may be compared to the succession of the 4 seasons, or the alternating brilliance of the sun and moon, or the things of the world, which are nourished side by side and do not harm one another. Their Taos were walked side by side, and were not contradictory. The powers of lesser virtue flow as in the current of a river. The powers of greater virtue deeply transform. This is the way in which heaven and earth are great. 31. Chapter 31. Only the greatest sage in the world possesses the keen powers of listening and seeing, penetration and wisdom that fit him to approach men as a ruler, the magnanimity, generosity, gentleness, and flexibility that fit him to accommodate others, the vigor, strength, firmness, and resolution that fit him to take a firm grip, the focus, seriousness, balance, and uprightness that fit him to be reverent, the pattern, order, concentration, and incisiveness that fit him to discriminate among different things. As arching vastness, as depthless springs, he brings forth all this according to the times. As arching vastness, he is like the heavens. As depthless springs, he is like the deep. When he appears, none fail to respect him. When he speaks, none fail to have faith in him. When he acts, none fail to be content. For this reason, his singing fame overflows the central states and is carried forth even to the tribes of north and south. Wherever boats or carts travel on or human labor reaches, whatever heaven covers or earth supports, wherever the sun or moon shine or frosts and dews descend, none of blood and breath do not revere and cleave to him. Hence, he is said to be the match of Tian. 32. Chapter 32. Only the most perfectly genuine Cheng, perfectly Cheng man in all the world can thread together all the great constant norms of the world. So genuine, sincere can be translated as, keep that in mind whenever you see genuine, Cheng, can thread together all the great constant norms of the world. Only the most perfectly genuine man can do this, can plant the great roots of the world, and can understand the nurturing transformations of Tian Di, heaven and earth. How would he rely on any other than himself? How sincere he is in his Ren, humanity. Depthless like the abyss, vast like the Tian, the heavens. Apart from one who is keen of hearing and sight, sage in wisdom, and fulfilled in Tian-like virtue, who could understand this? The Shi Jing, book of poetry, says, whenever you see these quotations from the book of poetry, keep in mind that the verses of the book of poetry were intoned with musical accompaniment. and this final chapter may be understood as a semi-musical conclusion of chant and comment, singing the praises of the sage as a force of virtue beyond the power of sound or sight to grasp, is what Professor Ino notes there in the margins. So this is the final chapter, the coda, he calls it, the invisibility of ultimate virtue. Ultimate virtue is kyoku toku. I forget the Chinese reading for it. The poetry, book of poetry says, over the brocaded robes, a plain dress. She disliked displaying the patterns. Thus the Tao of the Junza is hidden dark and grows brighter every day. The Tao of the small man strikes the eye but fades every day. The Tao of the Junza is limpid, and one never tires of it. Simple yet patterned, gentle yet ordered. He who knows that the distant shall be near. He who knows that moral influence has no source. He who knows that subtle shall be manifest. With such a one you may enter into virtue. The Shijing poetry says, though they be submerged in concealment, they are yet so plain to see. Hence the Junza examines himself and is without flaw, with no evil in his will. The manner in which the Junza surpasses others lies in what others cannot see. The Shijing poetry says, looking into your chambers, let there be nothing shameful even in the inmost corner. Hence men respect the Junza though he does not act, have faith in him though he has not spoken. The Shijing, or poetry, says, approaching without words and so without strife. Hence the Junza persuades the people without issuing rewards, is without anger. Yet the people are awed as if by an axe. The Shi poetry says, brilliant his virtue. The many lords emulate him. Hence the Junza is profoundly reverent and the world is at peace. The poetry says, I cherish bright virtue with no great sound or appearance. The master says, sound and appearance having nothing to do with transforming the people. The Shi poetry says, virtue light as a hair. Yet there remain things comparable to a hair. The Shi says, the revolutions of heaven above possess neither sound nor smell. That is the ultimate. Alright, that's the end of the Zhongyong, the Doctrine of the Mean. I've read it in full. Now we will go over the glossary very briefly. It's a short glossary that goes over the major titles of texts and terms that appear in both of these works, the Daxue and the Zhongyong. Let's take a very short break here and then I'll go over these. Alright, we should be familiar with these already, just having read through these two works, the Daxue and the Zhongyong, but let's go over them very briefly. The Book of Documents, or the Shu, is one of the 5 classics. Book of Documents is one of the 5 Confucian classics, the Wujing, along with the Book of Poetry and 3 other works. The Documents, the Shu, includes speeches and narratives, all in archaic, difficult language, chronologically arranged, from tales of the legendary kings Yao and Shun through the Zhou era, with one final text, the Oath of Qing, purporting to date from the spring and autumn era, 771 to 453 BC. A small number of these chapters seem to be records of statements by earlier Zhou leaders that were recorded as texts not long after the time of their purported authorship, but most of the chapters seem to be much later in date, probably from the Warring States period or shortly after. Right. Keep in mind, of course, that this is Professor Ino's glossary that I'm reading right now, as was his introduction, written by Professor Ino. Book of Poetry, the Shi, which the Zhongyong quotes from frequently as. Hold on. PDF just got out of control. Okay, we're almost done. Just the remaining words in the glossary, terms in the glossary, and titles in the glossary. The Book of Poetry, the Shi, as I mentioned many times during the recitation. The Book of Poetry is an anthology of 305 poems dating from approximately the time of the Zhou conquest in the 11th century to the 7th century BCE. Unlike the Book of Documents, the Shu, the Book of Poetry, the Shi, was essentially complete by the late spring and autumn era, the time of Confucius. Although the poems are varied in authorship and nature, the anthology was understood to have been compiled by sagely men, including Confucius, who is believed to have ordered the poems. The odes of the Book of Poetry were part of the education of young elite men who memorized them and learned how to chant them. They were all as much songs as poems, and who were taught that even the light-hearted love songs among them were pregnant with meaning that led the sage anthologist to include them. Okay, the next term is the Tao. The term Tao, often translated as the way, denotes the ideal moral path for individuals, rulers, and states to follow in order to realize a perfection of character and life that is destined for humankind, if only humankind summons the will to follow its natural calling. The basic meaning of the term Tao is path, and it often is used metaphorically in this sense. The Tao can be walked or traveled, just as a path can be. However, there is also a secondary meaning of method or formula. Many different schools of Warring States era thought called their central teachings the Tao, most famously the school of Taoism, which used the term in a cosmological sense so distinctive that it was later applied as the name of the school. The Confucian Tao focuses on various forms of ethical conduct on the personal, social, and political levels associated with sage rulers of the past. Destiny, we'll get to that later, is the Ming. Filiality, filial piety, xiao, oyakoko no ko in Japanese. Filiality is xiao, pertains specifically to the relationship that a child, for early Confucians, a son especially, bears toward his parents, usually conceived in terms of the father. Mencius theory lays great emphasis on innate moral dispositions, and in the Mencius, it is explicitly presumed that every person possesses at birth an unqualified disposition to love his or her parents. The preservation and extension of this love are the building blocks of adult morality. Xiao, filiality, was a pervasive value in early Chinese folk ethics. Confucianism was conservative in promoting it as a cardinal virtue, but radical in both the degree of stress placed on it and the ethical generalizations that it drew from filiality. Okay, so the idea of filiality precedes Confucius, but Confucianism stressed it even more so than it had been stressed in the past. Both the Great Learning, the Daxue, and the Doctrine of the Mean, the Zhongyong, view adult morality as unthinkable without filiality. So filiality is kind of the core of any ethics. The Great Learning, Daxue, emphasizes the necessity to cultivate and expand filial dispositions so as to master familial dynamics and become capable of social leadership. The Zhongyong, Doctrine of the Mean, analyzes the most exalted political achievements as expressions of filial devotion. So filial devotion is kind of the model for understanding all of ethics and politics. Human nature, Qing. The phrase Qing or human nature renders this singular. Qing is actually the nature of any living thing. And sometimes texts preface the term with ren to clarify that it is human rather than say an animal's nature. So anything can have a sei. In Japanese it's read sei. In Chinese, Xing. An animal's nature is under discussion, though this is never at issue in the Daxue or the Zhongyong. Both those texts adopt the mentioned view that human nature is innately endowed with moral dispositions and is thus the seat of goodness. Right? So Xing, human Xing, according to Mencius especially, is the seat of goodness. It's good. Human nature is good. It just needs to be cultivated and perfected and led. The schools of Mencius and Junza debated this point. The Junza includes a chapter arguing that human nature is actually bad. So Junza and Mencius have this famous fight about the nature of humanity, and Junza says that human nature is bad, defining Xing in terms of our innate self-regarding appetites. But the Great Learning, the Daxue, and the Doctrine of the Mean, Zhongyong, do not argue the issues. The mentioned position is axiomatic for both texts. Okay, so the Daxue and the Zhongyong start from the Mencian premise that humans, Qing, is good. That should be clear by now as we've read both of these works. Humanity is the next term, ren in Chinese. Japanese say jing. The term ren was a Confucian key word, the meaning of which was much affected by context. Okay, humanity, ren, it's often humaneness. Its employment as an ethical term may well have been an innovation of Confucius. In the Analects, ren is treated as a mysterious term. Disciples repeatedly ask Confucius what he means by it, and in most cases, in that text, ren seems to denote a comprehensive moral disposition, embracing all others. In other Confucian texts, however, the meaning of the terms seems more restricted, corresponding to a disposition toward care and concern. Underline these, care and concern. Ren. I think Heidegger, when he talks about care, might have had ren in mind when doing so. Heidegger, of course, was very influenced by East Asian thought. Care and concern for others, rooted strongly in family love, but extending toward others in varying degrees of strength, which may be increased through a regimen of ethical self-cultivation. It is often discussed as one in a set of cardinal virtues, among which righteousness, yi, discussed below, is its most regular partner. So ren and yi are usually discussed as a pair. Next is genuineness, or cheng, which we saw crop up many times in this work, a difficult term to translate. Cheng is perhaps a central concept of the Zhongyong, Doctrine of the Mean, and some scholars believe that it is equally the pivot of the Daxue as well. And this was the position held by the Ming dynasty Neo-Confucian Wang Yangming, who we'll get to later in this class. Its basic meaning is probably best described in the Daxue, and there's a quote here that says, Cheng describes a process of perfect inner correspondence. End quote. The correspondences between the innate moral dispositions, our awareness of them, our judgments about the thing or affair that has triggered that disposition, and our expression of all these in action. The person who proceeds from genuineness, from Cheng, responds to the world with feelings that stem directly from a spontaneous moral sense of liking or disliking, approving or disproving, and that response takes the form of action appropriate to affect the world in a way that will effectively express that response. The life of the perfectly genuine and naturally perfect in the same manner as the natural creative flow of cosmic creation and action. This notion, embryonic in the Mengzi, Mencius, and the Daxue Great Learning, but expressed more clearly in the Zhongyong, Doctrine of the Mean, became a foundational notion in Neo-Confucian thought from the 11th century onwards, and accounts for the Neo-Confucian promotion of the Daxue and the Zhongyong as core Confucian canon. And of course, in Japan too, in the Edo period, Neo-Confucianism was very central, and this idea of makoto was absolutely essential to Japanese thought. We'll discuss that more in the study guide. For more on specific issues, okay. Next term is Junza. The term Junza translates literally as ruler's son or prince. It originally referred to members of the hereditary nobility. Yes, Kitamai Kunshi usually means the prince in Japanese context, but in Confucian context it means somebody with who demonstrates exemplary virtue. It came to be associated more or less with their superior manners than with their birth. So as we saw here in this work, in the Zhongyong, one can be of low birth, one can be poor, and still attain the status of Junza through cultivation of self and cultivation of virtue. So in this sense, the term is parallel to gentleman, and it is commonly translated in that way. However, although Junza sometimes simply refers to an ordinary ruler or member of the elite class, it more often denotes an ideal of human excellence. This is the important part, underline it. An ideal of human excellence that was at the center of Confucian ethics. Some texts employ the term as part of a lexical set denoting ascending levels of moral perfection, with Junza denoting a relatively modest attainment. So note that the sage, as we saw here in this work, the sage ranks above the Junza. Other texts allow the term to denote much higher levels of ethical perfection. As we see here, it can sometimes be used as an equivalent for the term sage, which refers to the most celebrated type of moral exemplar. We'll get to sage below. Because the term is used with such a broad range of applications, some translators render it with relatively unfamiliar phrasing, such as noble person or authoritative person. Some people have compared it to Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, as I mentioned above. This is controversial, though. So others say that the Junza and the Übermensch are completely different and should not be compared. That's something we'll discuss later. It is left in transcription here too. Okay. All right, and a few more words in the glossary. Let me take a quick break before I pass out. All right, well, we've already passed the 90-minute mark. We got to get this wrapped up as quickly as possible. Li is the next word in the glossary. Ritual or rites. The term li, Japanese say re, poorly rendered as ritual, denotes a vast formal and informal code of stereotyped conduct that ranges from ordinary etiquette to intricately choreographed ceremonies of court and religion. The reason that ritual is a poor translation is that in the modern West, ritual sometimes signifies triviality, mere ritual, whereas for most of the educated elite in China, li was an essential component of good human conduct. What unites the various categories of li is the common feature of form. Action according to li exhibits respect for others and for oneself by marking it with the syntax of civilization. Those who act without li are behaving like the non-Chinese barbarian tribes, speaking a foreign language of interpersonal conduct that has not yet been touched in the Chinese view by the influence of ethics and virtue. So li is what distinguishes the civilized man, human, from the barbarian. Confucians were invested in li beyond ethical commitment. They were trained as masters of li, ordinary arbiters of ordinary etiquette and expert directors of formal ceremonial events. Many ordinary Confucians made their way in the world by serving as masters of court and religious ceremony, or as experts in family rituals such as coming-of-age rites, community feasts, marriages, and funerals, for which they were available for hire. It is not surprising, therefore, that in Confucian thought, li is viewed as the principal means of self-cultivation and the perfection of ethical sensibilities and skills. The Zhongyong, Doctrine of the Mean, integrates li into its portrait of the ideal society designed through sage wisdom. The Great Learning, the Daxue, however, never uses the term li, an unusual feature in a Confucian text. Even more surprising, since the text was originally anthologized, as I mentioned earlier, in the Li Ji, the Book of Rites. So this is included in the Book of Rites, the Li Ji, but it doesn't discuss li at all. The Daxue, that is. The Zhongyong, by contrast, does discuss this notion of li. Our next word is the Ming, or the mandate, in Japanese read mei, meirei no mei. Mandate, ordained, fate, destiny. It can also mean shukumei no me in Japanese, right? One of the more complex concepts in Confucianism, Ming, is translated flexibly here because of its many different shades of meaning. Readers of the Chinese text, however, would always react with attention to any of these uses because of its important philosophical force. The most famous use of this term is in the phrase Tian Ming, the mandate of heaven, right? Remember this, Tenmei, right? In Japan, you have the Tenmei era, uses this, meaning these characters together, meaning the mandate of heaven, the Tian Ming, Tenmei, which, according to Zhou dynasty era belief, was a license to occupy the throne of universal ruler that was bestowed by divine fiat. Although the term Ming is used in that sense in the Daxue and the Zhongyong, the term Tian Ming also refers to that which Tian ordains as our moral endowment. That which is ordained by Tian is called our nature. For example, is a passage from the Zhongyong. chapter 1, another passage that says, regard this bright mandate of Tian, in reference to making bright virtue brilliant in the great learning and so forth. Additionally, although the term Ming may refer to outcomes that cannot be influenced by effort or fate, we may see that usage in the Daxue as well. Okay, I think you get the idea of what this term Ming means. Moving on. Next we have righteousness or right, being right. Yi Mencius theory holds that among the dispositions human beings innately possess, there is a sense of right, or Yi. So Yi is a sense of right that we have, by which Mencius means righteousness, a sense of moral right and wrong. This is Yi. Even though Junza disputes Mencius's portrait of human nature, remember Junza is the guy who says that humans are innately evil. Even though he disputes Mencius's portrait of human nature, Junza claims that humans do indeed possess a sense of right and wrong, a sense of Yi. But he does not mean by this a moral sense. He means a sense of appropriateness or fit, as when we may say that a painting crookedly hung on the wall is not right. Although the term Yi does not play a major role in the Great Learning and the Doctrine of the Mean, we do find in the latter text, in the Zhongyong, the Ladder of the Mean, that it is paired with ren, or humanity, glossed by the term appropriate, and in mentioned fashion, linked to a moral framework, specifically honoring the worthy, we saw in chapter 20. Alright, moving on. The sage, or shang, shang, sei in Japanese, sei naru, like means holy or worthy, it's often translated as. The term shang or sage denotes a supreme level of both moral perfection and wisdom in a hierarchy of terms that includes Junza. So Junza is a category under this larger category of shang, sage. When applied to individuals, sage generally denotes an exemplary person of historical importance. Yao and Shun, the great legendary founders of civilization according to Confucian myth, are models of shang, or sages. They pair moral perfection with the highest levels of political accomplishments. And then, finally, this is the last term, I think. No, we have a few more. We have this idea of ge wu kakumotsu, kakubutsu in Japanese, aligning affairs, or coming into things is a more literal translation. This is a very important phrase that we saw in Daxue as well. This phrase, which is identified as a starting point of self-cultivation in the Great Learning. Alright, so according to the Daxue, the Great Learning, ge wu is the starting point of self-cultivation. This is perhaps the most contested term in the text. There's been much ink spilled over this term, just at the point where we would expect the phrase to be explained. There is a textual gap and it is not unclear whether part of the explanation remains or is entirely missing, so it's possible that part of this section of the Daxue disappeared over the centuries. The Chinese phrase is not itself clear. The first of the two characters, ge, kaku in Japanese, may mean to come, to go to reach, or to align or rectify, while the second character, wu, may mean thing, mono in Japanese, right? Butsu, motsu, mono. It means thing, is the sense of an object or an affair or both. The standard English rendering, popularized in Mengzi Chan's translation and his studies of Neo-Confucian thought, is investigating things. Alright, so I think Wikipedia entry for ge wo says has it as investigating things, reflecting the interpretation of Zhu Xi, the Neo-Confucian of the Song dynasty who compiled the 4 books. Zhu understood the literal meaning of to be, to reach, things and affairs, which captured the idea of immersing oneself in the world of objects and events, or even texts, in order to grasp the normative order of the cosmos, a kind of being in the world, you might say. The phrase means to exhaustively arrive at the principles of matters, missing no point as one reaches the ultimate. Okay, the Ming dynasty, Neo-Confucian Wang Yang Ming, who we'll talk about later in this class, who disputed many aspects of Zhou's editing and interpretation of the Daxue, glossed the phrase very differently, believing that it denoted a dynamic of coming to understand the world through the effort to perfect it. Reflecting his own philosophical maxim, knowledge and action are one. Underline that. Whenever you see Wang Yang Ming, the Ming Dynasty Neo-Confucian Wang Yang Ming, he's usually discussed in this context of his important teaching that knowledge and action are one. It's Kodo Shugi, right? Actionism. The interpretation in this translation is based on identifying the fragmentary comment. Okay. I think you get the sense of what Ge Wu means according to Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming. Tian is the final term in this glossary. Tian, or ten in Japanese. Tian was the high deity of Zhou state religion. Okay, so they don't have a god. They have Tian instead in the Zhou dynasty state religion. Originally, Tian was solely worshipped by the small ethnic group of the Zhou, who prior to the conquest of the Shang in 1045 BC were located on the outskirts of the region, united to greater and lesser degrees. But the Shang royal house, the state religion of the Shang included a pantheon, at the apex of which resided a different high deity, the Di, or the emperor, the Wang Di, the Di. After the conquest, texts suggest that the Zhou chose to identify Tian and Di, treating these as alternative names for a single deity. During the Warring States period, certain texts, both Confucian and otherwise, include instances where Tian seems stripped of any character of conscious agency, and in those cases it more closely corresponds to Western concepts of nature in the sense of cosmic order. Okay, so you see this tendency in Confucian writings not to personify the Tian, whereas before Confucius, the Tian is often personified. The Junza sometimes uses the term in this explicit sense, and this accords well with some instances in the Doctrine of the Mean, in the Zhongyong. The word Tian means sky, literally, and the word is often translated as heaven. It is left untranslated here except in cases where it seems to carry the meaning of sky. So when it's used literally, he just uses the word sky, but when it's used in the sense of the Tian, or sort of principle of cosmic principle or order of nature, he uses the word Tian, as in the phrase Tian Di, heaven and earth, right? Tian Di, which we saw many times in this text, which as a compound term is itself close to the sense of nature. Alright, that's the end of this super long video. I didn't expect it to take this long, but it has. Might be a good idea to watch the whole thing in, on speed, on 2.0 YouTube video speed, so that you can get through it without getting bogged down in all the details. Alright, that's all. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.